Okay, so our topic for today is healing ritual and psychotherapy. Obviously, this is central to the whole area of medical anthropology, of psychiatric anthropology, and of cultural psychiatry, insofar as we're interested in helping people and helping them not only through the tools of psychiatry and psychology, but potentially through various forms of collaboration with indigenous forms of healing. But that requires that we have not a sort of open-minded blanket endorsement of indigenous healing, but some understanding in our own frameworks of how indigenous healing might work and of where it may be useful and where it may not be useful. And so that requires a kind of set of frameworks that we can use maybe to think very generally about healing and about therapeutic practices. And that's what I'd like to introduce today. And the first half will be about healing in general, particularly various kinds of healing systems that have developed historically and in different cultures, and how they may be understood to work on different levels, and how they may underlie a lot of our own practices in mental health. And the second half today will focus more specifically on psychotherapy. And by that I mean, or I'll explain more what I mean, but what I mean essentially are forms of healing or intervention that focus on the psyche, that is, on the person's inner theater of experience, their self-narration, their understanding of themselves as an actor. And so processes of narratively understanding and interpreting and transforming that kind of experience, which are a subset of the broad set of things we could call healing. And so that's how we'll approach it today. And this image will be, of my opening slide will become clear as we go along. So here's what I'm going to talk about, a little bit about universal aspects of healing at a very general abstract level. Then more specifically about some of the most basic elemental systems of healing that occur in small-scale societies that contain many of the elements, the conceptual elements of more elaborate systems of healing, and so are worth studying from that point of view. Then a shift toward looking at some basic emotional processes in healing, and in particular on the role of catharsis in ritual and healing and the aesthetic properties of healing rituals. And then opening up onto the broad array of healing systems to consider what they have in common and how they differ and how they may coexist in a pluralistic healthcare system. And then what I'll try to present you with is a kind of framework for thinking about different processes or mechanisms or levels of healing that may be operating in different systems. And part of the argument will be that even though any given healing system, medical system, has its own theory of how it works, it may focus only on some aspects. And an outsider or a person coming from another system might say, well, that's interesting, but I can see other things happening in your system that are also going on. So we could come up with a more comprehensive model that lists many different kinds of healing that are going on, only some of which are theorized and focused on within a particular healing system. And then, as I say, the second half today we'll talk about psychotherapy more specifically. So there are, as I mentioned, a great variety of healing systems. I'm going to mention some of these which kind of stand in a lineage, if you will, thinking of contemporary biomedicine and psychological medicine. I'm going to talk about shamanism, or shamanistic healing. I'm going to talk about Asclepian medicine in ancient Greece, humoral medicines, and other kinds of systems of energy medicines, and then about biomedicine and psychotherapy. What is universal across all these different systems that makes them systems of healing? Well, some ideas about this were put forward by the social psychiatrist Jerome Frank about 50 years ago, when he proposed that we could look at all systems of healing as being equivalent at some very abstract level. That is, they all have notions of defining a person as a sufferer, and that goes with notions of affliction. And in fact, he argued that the most basic element of all healing scenarios in terms of the experience of affliction was a state of what he called demoralization. People have lost hope, they're torn down. And that cuts across very many different conditions, each of which might have their own specificity, but it's a common element, he argued, in most forms of suffering. The second component is a person who's defined as a healer. So this is a person who has some knowledge or some power or can create a certain scenario in which some kind of healing process can take place. And so behind that person of the healer, there are notions of authority, of knowledge, of access to some kind of power. Then there is a prescribed ritual time and place where healing is going to take place. Diagnosis, treatment, healing is going to take place. In ancient Greek medicine, this is called the Temenos, the sacred place where healing took place, and I'll explain that a bit more in a moment. And within that space and time, there's some kind of ritual action. It might be an involved ritual with making certain kinds of offerings. It might mean prescribing a medication for someone. It might mean just simply doing certain diagnostic things and then giving a person reassurance. There's a wide range of things in different traditions that people can practice. Along with those actions come some expectations, not just the actions, I suppose, but also the setting, the temenos, the place where this occurs, the authority of the healer, the need of the patient as a sufferer. All these things converge on creating strong expectations for healing and recovery. And with those expectations, in effect, come hope. So remoralization or hope is the direct antidote to demoralization. So simply at that level of changing a person's attitude, it's easy to see the logic of healing in this very general way. And in his book, Persuasion and Healing, which went through several editions and some interesting changes as it went along, but at the first edition of it, Jerome Frank really tried to make the argument that psychotherapy and various forms of traditional or indigenous healing had the same logical structure. That the things people said and did were different, and that fit their culture and their expectations. But at this very basic level of transformation of experience, there was a lot of parallelism. And in saying that, he was hoping not only to valorize, I guess, traditional healing or to take psychotherapy down a notch, particularly at a time when certain forms of therapy were claiming to have very special efficacy. So psychoanalysis was claiming to have a unique and special efficacy, and he was making an argument for the idea of a general efficacy across many different kinds of healing. But the point being also that not just to say, well, everything works and it all works in the same way, but to offer some conceptual tools and an approach to begin to study these processes. So that's the trace we're going to try to follow forward. And also to consider that there are some other features of most forms of healing, and he called this initially symbolic healing, he also called it interpersonal healing in later discussions. And there's some other elements that I think we're going to try to emphasize as we go along that are implicit in some of his discussion but have become clearer as other people have worked on this. First of all, when you look around the world at the great variety of healing systems, most of these occur not one-to-one with a healer helping an individual, but with a group of people. And that has a lot of importance. The group of people steers the suffering person toward the healer, they engage with the healer, and whatever the healer or healing ritual may do, it's affecting many people at the same time. So if we're trying to trace the efficacy and the remoralization or the hope or all the other things that occur, maybe those pathways are not just going through that one person, maybe they're going through a whole social environment and a network, and we need to look at that. The second thing is that the authority of the healer, the power that's invested in the healer, is embedded in a larger system. In many societies, these systems are related to religious practice. So in effect, the authority of the healer is drawing from some of the most powerful social institutions and the ones that people are most deeply invested in. In our own society, in terms of biomedicine, that has become science. And for many people, science functions as a kind of profound authority, whether they know much science or not. If people say, well, science is shown, then they feel very confident that there's a powerful basis for this, and it increases their investment and their hope and faith and so on. So we could say at that level that we're not really talking about science itself as an intellectual activity, but a kind of scientism, a kind of faith in science, a kind of belief in science to answer all these questions that functions in an analogous way to other ideological systems for people. So this whole dynamic of the authority of the healer is important to understand, and again, it varies with different religious systems, with different social configurations, and so on. In the later editions of his book, Persuasion and Healing, Jerome Frank came to emphasize not just symbolic action as though one is doing something at a sort of symbolic level and it has a direct effect, but the nature of persuasive talk, and which leads you toward the study of rhetoric. Rhetoric is really, historically the study of how language is used to move people. How do you say something in a way that really stirs people emotionally, that makes them feel, wow, this is profound, things are changing, I feel affected. And so the more we understand that, whether that's through words, through gestures, through images, the more we understand how to really engage with people and how some rituals might have a very compelling and profound effect for people. The power of symbols somehow needs to be rooted in people's experience. We talked about this a little bit at the very beginning of the course when we were talking about ideas of cultural phenomenology and the idea that certain images or words or smells or tastes or experiences will be very deeply resonant for some people because they have had layers and layers of experience attached to that. At the same time, we're always being introduced in a global society to new images and new practices, and those are usually sold to us or conveyed to us by using other hooks that we have that also have a developmental basis, but that can allow us then to sort of connect to something that is a bit new and a bit different and find that compelling. So understanding the individuals or the communities learning history, where these certain practices come from and what is sedimented in those practices in terms of the past is important for understanding their evocative power. All of that surrounds the whole notion that there's an aesthetics of healing performance. That is to say, people are affected by the sensory, sensual, emotional qualities, and more than that, by the kind of intellectual structure and the entire shape of a performance that conveys not only information to people, not only expectations, but a kind of aesthetic experience. And by that I mean a sense of things being ordered, being interesting, maybe disordered and asymmetrical, but in a way that's interesting and engaging and that has aesthetic properties. It can be beautiful, it can be ugly, but it's compelling in some way for people at that level, and that's again part of its power. Finally, if you think of the politics and the economy of healing practice, every healing system has to have ways of identifying and advertising its successes and managing its failures so that it maintains credibility. And in fact, if you look at the ancient Hippocratic corpus in medicine, part of it is advice to the healer on how to know when to call it quits and to distance themselves from the person who's going to die. That is, you don't want to be associated with a failure in some way, so you need to say, oh, this is not going to turn out well because the person is very seriously ill, and my condolences, kind of, but you don't want to take the rap for that. And ironically, I would say we have that kind of system today with certain diagnoses that get applied to people that are nihilistic in a way. So I mentioned earlier that sometimes personality disorder diagnoses are used in a way to express a kind of therapeutic nihilism, and we could say that one function of those is not particularly to help patients, because it's very dispiriting and demoralizing to get that kind of a label if that's what it means to other people, but to protect the profession, to protect professionals and the authority of professionals, since if we claim that a person is not going to do well, whatever we do, we're sort of insulating ourselves as practitioners from our potential failures. So I think it's important to understand those sociological functions because that's how a healing system is maintained, not simply because it's successful. You'll often hear with respect to indigenous healing in the popular media, this form of traditional medicine must work because it's been around for thousands of years. And I think that's kind of naive. There are lots of things that are around for thousands of years that are not good ideas that people still do. And really you have to ask, what functions does it serve? I'm sure it serves some function, but it may not be the function of absolutely curing people of what it claims to cure people of. It may serve other functions, and it may persist for those reasons, and that applies to biomedicine or psychiatry as well as to anything else. So understanding the social dynamics of how the healing system works is part of understanding its broader social efficacy, which may be a little bit different than specific claims that are being made for helping this or that problem. So all of these things I've just mentioned are embedded in larger cultural systems. They draw their power, they draw their coherence, not just from their internal logic, but from the way they reference other kinds of beliefs and practices that people have. So let's talk a little bit about an elemental system of medicine, elementary system of medicine, that is to say a system of medicine that occurs in small-scale societies where there's not a lot of specialization of roles or big institutions, and that's shamanism. Strictly speaking, shamanism is a term that comes from certain Siberian peoples, Tungu and peoples in a certain region of Siberia who were hunters, and the system of medicine that they developed involves using animal powers. The animal spirits provide power to the healer or through the healer to help human beings. So the importance of animal spirits fits with it being a hunting culture. And the shaman typically is able, through having this connection to animal spirits or animal powers, to diagnose and to intervene on another level, on another plane of existence. And sometimes this shaman will make a spirit voyage, will go from the mundane plane of this visible world to a spirit plane to make a diagnosis and to make an intervention. The shaman does this based on the power that he or she has acquired from the animal help or animal spirit. Typically, since there are no schools for shamans in small-scale societies, although nowadays we do have schools for shamans, mostly ersatz shamans, but they do exist. But in traditional societies, it was the shaman's own illness experience that gave him the kind of insight and the kind of power to heal. So there's a basic kind of logic there, kind of what Jung called the logic of the wounded healer. That is to say, if you've had an injury or suffering of some kind, an illness of some kind, and you have survived, it's as though you've passed to the other side and come back, and you have some special knowledge. The very fact that you survive suggests you have some knowledge or some strength or something that maybe you can use to share with other people. And typically in these healing systems, the shaman would have a kind of initiatory illness experience, or maybe an initiatory dream or some other experience in which he or she felt contacted by a spirit, and that gave him initially perhaps an illness that then he or she had to solve himself through some kind of engagement with the spirit, and then coming through that, recovering from that, he was then imbued with power. I showed you a film earlier when we were talking about some film clips when we were talking about dissociation of a contemporary form of shamanistic practice among Chinese healers, Dan Qi, in Singapore, where the pantheon of gods are not animal spirits anymore, but are Taoist deities that then can inhabit the shaman and speak through him. So it's a little bit of a different system, but there are analogies, which is why people use the term shamanism for that. The narrow use of the term shamanism would just be for this kind of healing practice in hunter peoples, where the shaman is able to travel to another world and get this information and make the intervention. The experience that I described with the Dan Qi is actually of becoming possessed, and it's the god or the deity that then speaks through the healer, and it's in a larger religious framework involving this, in this case, popular Taoism. So this portrait, and this is a picture, I think, of a Goldie shaman, another Siberian group. And there are reasons to believe, archaeological reasons to believe, that this is a very old form of healing practice. And these are images from, I think this is from the Trois Frères caves in France, some other Paleolithic site, where you have imagery associated with the hunt, and in this case a staff with a bird on top of it, and some other images that are similar to kinds of paraphernalia that you find among contemporary shamans. There's this image on another cave wall, and when you look closely at it, what you see is the outline of an animal in which the bones are visible through the skin, and this is typical of shamanic imagery. So there's a kind of X-ray vision going on, and you can understand the origins of that culturally. If you're a hunter people, you butcher animals, you know a lot of the insides of animals, but the idea that you could somehow magically see through an animal into the insides is a special power now, based on your knowledge, but based on this spiritual power. And then you see the face of the animal that has a kind of human kind of transformation. The eyes are right in front, staring quote right out at you. And that resembles more contemporary shamanic mask, this one from Alaska, a Yupik mask. So we think we know a little bit, sort of reconstructing both from this kind of archaeological evidence and from what has been found in hunter peoples on first encounter that was described by ethnographers. We think we can sort of figure out a little bit of what these early healing practices were like in terms of the logic. The imagery in this healing, as I say, is related to animals. It's related to the idea of two levels of existence. And so here again is another shaman's costume, and it has an image on one side of it here of a tree in the center. And the tree as a symbol, in this case, people who are living below the tree line, of connecting the earth and the sky. And there's often imagery of the shaman being able to go up into the sky in some ways and see the world from there, or in some traditions to be able to travel underground. The great anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss used this kind of healing to theorize how symbolic healing could occur. And he used a particular example, actually, that had been published by other ethnographers, had described a practice of healing practice among the Kuna people in Panama. And in particular, they had described a healing ritual that was used for a woman who was having difficulty in childbirth. She was having painful and ineffective childbirth. The baby was not coming out properly, and there were particular rituals that were performed by the shamans to help in this healing practice. And Lévi-Strauss kind of analyzed this, and he argued that the songs that the healers were singing, which are called ikarkana in this tradition, when you looked at the narrative, when you looked at the structure of them, there was an analogical parallel between the way that we could understand the problem of the woman and the story, the mythic story that was being told in the song. And so the song that the healer's singing says something like, the healer is going with his spirit guide into a narrow passageway, into a very tight place, and then bringing out a light into an open space. And so there's this image then of, okay, the woman is having trouble with, contractions, and the baby's not coming out. And so somehow by telling this story of going into the tight place and the tense place and being there, and then coming out into an open, easy place, that the woman herself and her body would be carried along in some way. So there's a kind of mapping from the state of affliction to a mythic representation of that, a symbolic representation of it, and then a transformation in the narrative with the idea that somehow then the bodily experience is being carried along, and so that you would be in a new state. So it's an appealing kind of account, and even though there's some details that need to be worked out in terms of, well, how is it exactly that telling that story, but you could probably even feel that a tiny bit in the way I'm telling the story. If I start telling you that the shaman's going to this tight place, and then they come out into this open place, you can even feel a little bit in your body exactly that kind of mirroring of it. And so we can make an argument for how, and I'll be trying to reinforce this argument as we go along, how there could be a parallelism between a kind of metaphoric structure and a kind of narration and a kind of bodily experience. So this argument from Lévi-Strauss of the formal parallels between the shaman's song and the ritual structure and a physiological transformation was a very influential and interesting idea. There are some problems with the account. One of the notable problems of the account is that in that particular tradition, the healers often speak in an arcane language that the patient doesn't understand. So the hope, the simplistic hope that there's going to be a very direct parallel between I'm telling you a story now and you understand every word I'm saying and you're deeply engrossed and you're following it, was probably not working quite that way. It's also possible, of course, though, to communicate things not simply through words, but as I did here, through gestures, through music, through rhythm, and so on. So you could make the argument, if you like, that, well, Lévi-Strauss is right, but it's not really through the detailed words, it's through the whole structure, or even through the expectations people bring into the thing. If they know this is what's going to happen, then in their own mind they may be constructing a parallel story. So there are a variety of ways you can still maintain his account, and I think even if it does not apply as closely as he claimed for the specific example he used, it's certainly easy to see it applying in many other examples. So this is a a kind of basic structure of healing transformation that we could begin with and then ask, how can we flesh this out? How can we understand what the dynamics are? Can we eventually have a real mechanistic theory of what's going on in terms of cognitive processes or affective processes or bodily processes? And I think, we know enough now to think that, yes, we can probably begin to take this several steps further in our own thinking, and I'm going to try to do that with you. So that's the oldest, as far as we can describe, one of the oldest systems of healing. There are other old parallel systems, very simple systems, simply of viewing illness, for example, as being caused by some kind of intrusion of an object and removing the object. You see this in a lot of healing practices around the world, where a healer will, suck on the body to remove a poison, or will make something appear kind of that was taken out of the body. This happens in various kinds of healing practices. And there is in all this, as you can imagine, a performative aspect. That is, the shaman or the healer is performing for an audience. And so they may do dramatic things that are tricks in a way. That's part of the performance. It doesn't mean that that's the whole thing that they're doing, and they themselves may understand that, yes, I do certain things here to make it exciting for everybody and convince them that something important is going on, but the real thing that happens is the spirit comes and does this. So both things can coexist, even though, as I say, there are accounts where shamans are dipping a hand into a bucket of chicken guts and making it appear as though they're pulling it out of the person's abdomen. If you have a chance to see the film about Andy Kaufman, I think there's a scene toward the end, Man on the Moon, where he goes to the Philippines to have faith healing, and they're kind of clear that the healer is doing this kind of stuff. But it doesn't always mean that, therefore, the whole thing is strictly a performance with nothing underneath it. The two things can coexist. You could argue, again, that in biomedicine, there's certain things that we do that are performative, that are there to reinforce what we're doing. I mean, having a nice building and having your diplomas on the wall and a bunch of other things are essentially irrelevant to the core thing you're doing, but they're meant to create good expectations and give people a positive experience in the whole thing. So there may be an analogy there between how do you establish your credibility when you don't have the diplomas to put on the wall. Well, you have to have something that's going to be compelling to people right away. So that's a little bit about shamanistic practice. I mentioned that there are shaman schools now. I mean, this has become a kind of popular New Age kind of thing. There's a magazine called Shaman's Drum. People like doing shamanistic things because it involves a kind of imaginative voyage. And I think it's an interesting issue, again, for urban people who are very cut off from being hunters on the land, how much you can get into this. Years ago, I had the experience of being at a workshop where there was a American Indian healer who encouraged people to have this experience of inviting in an animal spirit. And it was very interesting for many of us, I think, to have this experience of imagining being inhabited by an animal. It's a kind of imaginative play, a kind of engagement with these things, and one can have interesting, compelling experiences. So human beings have a capacity to imagine these things that I think comes from our life experience, but in some ways also from the fact that we have direct analogies, embodied capacities that we share with other creatures, and it becomes a way of thinking through the logic of animal powers. Western medicine is usually traced to ancient Greece, sometimes to Egypt as well, but ancient Greece in particular. And the earliest forms of healing distinctive to ancient Greece are associated with the god Asclepius. This is an image of Asclepius here with his symbol, the single serpent wrapped around a staff. And this practice of Asclepian healing took place at temples around ancient Greece, usually in beautiful settings. So people would be going to a place that had nice foliage and fresh water and air and mountains and so on. And so it was appealing to people in the aesthetics of that time. And there you would make certain offerings, and then you would go to sleep in a place called the abaton, or a priest would sleep for you, on behalf of you, and you or the priest would dream. And in the dream, the god Asclepius might appear and give the solution to your illness, or literally transform your illness by appearing in your dream as a snake or a dog and licking your wounds. You would be transformed within the dream. You would be healed within the dream. So this is an interesting process of healing, and it has interesting connections with contemporary medicine and healing. And in fact, again, Jung was interested in Asclepian healing, and C.A. Meyer, one of Jung's students, wrote a whole book called Ancient Incubation and Modern Psychotherapy. This process of sleeping and having healing dreams was called incubation. And the idea from a psychological perspective, contemporary psychological perspective, was that something in your own psyche, in your own unconscious, would be called forth to compensate and to help transform your experience by creating a sort of auspicious setting, and this is where the notion of the Temenos comes from. This is an image from an ancient frieze of the god Apollo with a centaur, and this is connected directly to the story of the god Asclepius, because Asclepius began as a mortal. He was a son of Apollo with a mortal, and was then sent off because he was sort of disavowed by Apollo. He was sent off for training, as it were, to the centaur Chiron. And so the idea that this healer, this prototypical Greek healer, is trained by a centaur who is half animal, half person, I would argue is probably historically a trace of the links to shamanism. That the way that people probably introduced this kind of religious healing in Greece was by making some link to an older form of healing and saying, this new god now has all that stuff, he learned all that stuff, and he has more. You know, he's connecting these deities now from the pantheon of Greek gods, but he also has this dark, earthly animal power that he learned directly from his time with Chiron, who had the healing power. This is a picture of the Asclepion at Epidavros, one of the most famous of these sites. And this is a place called the Tolos, where they believe they may have kept snakes, because again, these were symbolic of healing. Symbolic, again, the logic of the symbolism. The snake sheds its skin and is as though it's reborn. So these images of rebirth are natural symbols, again, of healing. This is the area of the Abaton, where the incubation took place, where people slept and had their healing dreams. And now I want to take you on a very brief journey to the island of Kos. And this is the road of, it's all of course transformed. This is thousands of years later, but to show you the kind of sighting of a very large Asclepion that existed on the island of Kos. So this is the road going up to the Asclepion. This is the beginnings of the terrace steps. What you're seeing is just the bits that are left now, but you'll get a sense of the scale and the size of the whole thing, moving up to these different terraces, going up to where the temples were. This was the temple of Apollo, and you had a temple of Apollo and a temple of Asclepius. Apollo representing rationality, light, the authority of the gods, and Asclepius representing this more chthonic healing power. This is the remains of an altar where burnt offerings were made. And then around the site are these stelae with testimonials carved in them. So people are saying, you know, I came here with a problem, I was blind, and the god licked my wounds and I was healed. So you have a kind of testimonials that would increase people's expectations and hope and so on. You know, I can't give you the exact timing, but this will make the point actually, because they're right up until the Greco-Roman period. Because this thing, which was the first slide I showed you, and the reason I wanted to show you these images from Kos, is of great interest, because what you see in the background is the older Greek facade from the Asclepian temple, and these alcoves which contain statues. And what you see in the front is some rubble of a different kind of construction, typically Roman construction. And this is the school where Hippocrates taught. So you have another transition from shamanism to Asclepian healing, and now from Asclepian healing to what we see as the beginnings of modern medicine, of technical medicine, in the sense that now it becomes, even though Hippocrates says he's able to heal by the authority and the of the god Asclepius, he has a lot to say about how he actually does it and how you diagnose things and how to manage things and so on. So medicine's becoming a profession in a sense and a technology that human beings can learn about and can share and so on at this point. But just as the Asclepian healers had to appeal to this older tradition, Hippocrates had to appeal to the authority of this tradition. And this is meant to be a mosaic in the town hall in the island of Kos, showing Hippocrates welcoming the god Asclepius to the island so that he would have this authority. So what happens with Hippocratic medicine is that a system begins to develop of a theory of what illness is, a different theory that in this case begins to involve a balance of humors, of hot and cold, of wet and dry, of the elements, of earth, fire, air, water, and so on, and that the balance of these things is somehow going to explain different kinds of illness. And so it's a more elaborate metaphorical system, one that human beings can learn about because it's very close to our sensory experience of the world. There's an intuitive logic, a sensory logic to the appeal to things like hot and cold. We all have lots of those experiences. And there's a logic, a sensory logic to the idea that if an illness is very hot, then maybe cold will help. If you have a fever, putting a cold washcloth on your head feels better. So there's, again, a primitive experiential logic to all of this that makes it plausible for people, and which can then be elaborated in much more complex systems that have some of the same underlying structure. And we see this in hot-cold theories, which occur around the world in many, many different traditions. As I mentioned, I think earlier, there's a discussion years ago in anthropology to the extent to which hot-cold theories, which are found, for example, all throughout South America, whether they had migrated from one place and just diffused to every culture, or whether people were in effect reinventing these theories based on human experience. And I think that's very likely. I think there's such a basic experiential set of facts for people that it would not be hard for people to reinvent these theories, even though there is also diffusion. Then you have Hippocratic and then eventually Galenic medicine, which became this humoral theory of different things which survived all the way into contemporary, into the Middle Ages and Renaissance in Europe, and then other traditions within Islam, Unani medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, Chinese medicine, which also involve balances. So here's just a couple of ideas from this hot-cold theory. These are from a paper some time ago by anthropologist Alan Harwood, looking at Puerto Rican experiences of illness and healing, showing how different kinds of experiences and substances are classified as being cold, cool, or hot. And then the idea that certain illnesses will be classified that way and certain treatments will be classified in the opposite way, and so you can use one to counteract the other. I mentioned the humoral theories having persisted for a long time in Europe as being the core of Western medicine. And this is, we still have a lot of language about this. In depression, we talk about melancholic depression, which is black bile, essentially, melancholia. We have a lot of everyday words that come from these notions, and a whole theory of personality that still exists. You talk about a person being phlegmatic, and so on. In the case of Ayurveda, many of these same things can be mapped onto the doshas, the different essences or energies that exist in balance in a healthy person. And illnesses can be diagnosed then as an imbalance, as an excess or a deficiency of one or another dosha. And you can take plant medicines or do other kinds of things, make dietary changes, do various kinds of exercises and things that will then rebalance. So the logic here is both a sensory logic of hot, cold, wet, dry, all these other very basic, powerful experiences that are associated with illness, associated with health, and then a metaphor of rebalancing, re-equilibrating, which, as I say, has an intuitive logic. And so you can have an everyday acceptance of these things because people have a certain amount of metaphoric understanding right away, even without having great exposure or learning in these systems. But you can also have a great elaboration of this, so that in some cases, Ayurveda, Chinese medicine, Unani medicine, you have long texts with people working out very elaborate kinds of classifications and subtle distinctions that only an expert could make. And I think this dual grounding is important, and it'll become important even when we think about contemporary forms of healing. The idea that on the one hand there's an intuitive level that makes us think, okay, that makes some sense. I don't know much about this, but it makes some sense to me. I have some kind of experience that resonates with that. And the more scholarly or elaborated level where the person says, well, yes, you want to talk about it that way, that's okay. That's for the lay person. That's kind of a crude way. But we have a more sophisticated theory here that you have to study and learn all the details of. And it's a very elaborate, complex system. Historically, you could probably trace them. If you look long enough, and if you could dig out the earliest forms, you could probably find this early system, and then people elaborating and developing it in certain ways. What becomes interesting in terms of the epistemology is what is the logic that's used to move from one system to another. Does a person simply declare, here's a more elaborate system, and it suddenly appears, which is what seems to happen in some systems, or is there an empirical process of trial and error or experiment or some other way of deciding that this theory works or doesn't work in some way? The result is that we end up with systems in the contemporary world that are all traces of these older systems coming forward that become more and more elaborated. So in the case of Ayurveda, for example, this has gone from being a local system or a small-scale system, smaller-scale system of plant medicines and of being aware of the person's lived context or local context, to becoming an international pharmaceutical industry in which people produce purified products and they're distributed all over the world and they're marketed and packaged much the same as any other pharmaceutical. So everything I've said up till now can be appreciated, at least in part, in terms of a kind of logic of sensory experience and sensual experience. That is, we know why certain things are appealing, why certain things are comforting and painful at that basic sensory and sensual level. And I don't think we should ever discount that. When you walk into a hospital and you smell certain things, it may be very disturbing or it may be comforting. Certainly when you go to a healing spa and you smell nice incense and other things, that has a very positive experience. And one of the reasons that that's compelling for people, and people might prefer that given their choices to going to a hospital environment, may be quite simply at that sensory level, that certain things are disturbing and frightening and other things are comforting, and people are working with that in some ways, and healing systems work with that in some ways. Judith Farquhar has written at length about the ways in which Chinese medicine is a sensory and sensual experience. Many medicines are essentially foods, and you might go to a restaurant or to a shop where you would have a special tea or soup or decoction that's made that you take, and it has very distinctive tastes and flavors. Some might be pleasant, some might be unpleasant, but the sensory and sensual quality of that is a very powerful set of signals of information, of transformations of experience that are setting up expectations and that are part of a whole system of understanding how to heal. Having said that, we still have this dilemma. I mean, we're bombarded by sensory experiences all the time. Why do some sensory experiences become salient, and how do they transform, in particular, experiences of suffering? We can understand again how some sensory aspects of suffering, nausea, pain, and so on, could be transformed at this sensory level. But a lot of suffering is emotional, it's affective, it's related to experiences of loss, of grief, of fear, of intense emotions. So if we're looking for how healing practices transform people, we probably want to look at the level of emotions and affective transformation. And indeed, the anthropologist John Dow, building on Levi-Strauss's account, said that one way we can sort of refine Levi-Strauss's account to address the thing that's really left unclear in Levi-Strauss, which is, yes, these rituals seem to be moving people, but how do they move people? Why do they move people? What is it really that's the motive force? And he suggested that it's emotion that's the motive force, and that in some ways what's happening is certain aspects of experience are being linked to emotionally evocative symbols. That it's not just any symbol, it's a symbol that is emotionally meaningful to that person by reason of their own personal history or by reason of the culture that they grew up in, or some combination of those two. So by making that link, you now have a connection to an emotional state, and the word emotion in English comes from the word to move. And so there's no question that part of what we mean by the phenomenology of emotion is states that move us, that transform us, that make us change our posture, our stance, make us want to move, make us change our whole physical way of orienting toward the world. So that's his argument essentially. It's a similar kind of a structural analogy to Levi-Strauss, but with the key idea that you're making links to symbols that are emotionally laden, and then the movement, the transformation, is an emotional process. It's related to the nature of those emotions and how they're unfolding over time. So this connects us to another theme in healing, which is the notion of working with emotions, and in particular the model of that comes from the theory of catharsis. And you may know that in the early work of Freud and Breuer and work with Anna O, they talked about catharsis as a form of healing and saw that as crucial to the psychoanalytic process. And that's still part of popular imagination. Movies about therapy and healing often have this notion the person has some terribly buried secret, and at some point finally they blurt it out and they're relieved of it and they're dramatically transformed. That's the kind of Hollywood image of a healing moment in psychotherapy, this notion of catharsis. Which in many ways means literally expelling something from the body. Cathartic is something that literally causes you to expel things from the body. It's interesting to know that catharsis is a term from ancient Greek drama, and in fact Anna O's uncle was a scholar on ancient Greek drama and wrote a book about catharsis before Freud and Breuer wrote about catharsis. So what the connection is, what the historical connection is between our theories, our psychological theories of catharsis, and an earlier theory of drama coming out of ancient Greece is, I think, an interesting issue, again, of the sort of circulation of ideas. So I want to illustrate catharsis with a very different example than Greek theater. This is a picture of a kaluli person from the highlands of Papua New Guinea. This was written about in a wonderful book by Edward Schieffelin called The Sorrow of the Lonely and the Burning of the Dancers. This would be one of the all-time great titles for a book, I think. The kaluli have a practice called jizero, which is a ritual that they practice. It's not strictly a healing ritual, but you'll see the connections in a few moments, in which one village goes to another village to prepare for this ritual. They're the visitors, and they spend time preparing, maybe a couple of days preparing, collecting information, getting ready. So they get dressed in this regalia, they go into the longhouse where the audience is sitting and have these burning torches in the dark, and the dancers begin their songs. And they sing these songs, and the songs use the local topography of the region where they live, naming certain rivers and mountains and plots where they planted things, and naming them in a kind of topographic sequence. So the narrative structure of the songs parallels the geographic location. And the content of the songs is basically about being lonely, about missing relatives, about being hungry. Very elemental human experiences, relevant to the everyday life among the kaluli. And in fact, the songs are targeted to specific people in the audience. So that if I'm singing a song about you, and you lost a family member, I would mention, I missed my brother. And I would mention a particular place where you have a plot, a yam plot. So I mentioned, by the so-and-so tree, I lost my brother. By the such and such river, I was lonely. And it would go on like this repetitively in the dark. And what it looks like in the dark is a bit like this. Because you're jumping up and down and the leaves on your shoulders are flapping. Now from the kaluli point of view, what's happening as you're dancing is you become a bird. And in kaluli ontology, when people die, they go to the other side of the world, other level of the world, other plane of existence, but they're still visible to us as birds. So when we hear the birds singing in the jungle, we're hearing the voice of our ancestors. So you're beginning to get the aesthetic and dramatic sense of how powerful, how emotionally powerful this would be for people in this context where they're hearing these songs, seeing these emblems of the spirits, and feeling a very personal connection, and through the narrative structure, a very personal connection to their own story of loss. They perform for that village, and they tell stories of that village, and then later another village will do it back. So there's a kind of village-level reciprocity. Now, when you're listening to the story, let's say that you're hearing all these things that are reminiscent of recent things you've experienced, of losses, of of your own little piece of terrain. So the narrative structure, as I say, we talked last time about the ecocentric self. This is again people who are rooted to place very strongly, and so when you start talking about a narrative along a certain river from place to place to place, it's very powerful for those people. Their whole life is spent in connection to those areas of the land. We're talking about your loved ones. You're hearing this again and again. You're seeing this emotional thing going on all night. What happens at some point is you become overwhelmed and you pick up a burning torch and you burn the dancer on the shoulder. The dancers wear special epaulets so that they don't get badly burned, but they have scars, and the scars are badges of honor that they were a successful performer. So I think this is interesting from a point of view of catharsis theory, because you could say that catharsis theory argues that there's an optimal aesthetic distance for re-experiencing emotions in a way that is releasing and not re-traumatizing, right? If it's too little, you're not affected. If you're over-distant, let's put it the wrong way. Let's say if you're over-distant, if there's too much aesthetic distance, then you say, well, so what? Didn't do anything for me. I saw that play and did nothing for me. Saw the movie, did nothing for me. If it's under-distant, you feel re-traumatized, or you feel that the emotion is very intense. So the example I always use from my own personal experience is seeing the film Sophie's Choice with Meryl Streep. If any of you have seen that film, she's a Holocaust survivor. There's a moment where she's reliving the experience of having to choose which of her children will be killed in front of her. And, a kind of unbearable scenario, and I mean, the acting is so vivid and whatever, that my own experience with that at that moment was, this is too much. I can't bear this. I can't watch this. It's not entertaining anymore. It's not cathartic anymore. It's actually an assault. Right? There, other movies. I had one other experience like that. I forget what it's called. Maybe it's a film in which Dustin Hoffman plays some guy, and at some point he's being tortured by having his teeth drilled. So that was another one that was like, okay, too much, But we all differ, obviously, and it depends on our mood and who we are and what the particular symbols are, whether we're going to find that very disturbing or not. But there's an optimal distance. The optimal aesthetic distance, you feel moved, you might cry, you might laugh, but you feel release, you feel good. I mean, you can cry at a movie or a play and come out feeling great. Why? Because you're not crying in quite the same way as if that actual horrible thing was actually happening to you. You're really going through a kind of transformation. So this idea of aesthetic distance is central to the theory of catharsis and of dramatic catharsis. And I think what we see in the kaluli ritual in an interesting way is a kind of regulation of that catharsis interpersonally. That is to say, that aesthetic distance, that people are maybe experiencing certain moments where it's under-distant, where it's too much, and they're getting up and actually doing something to express the intensity of what they're feeling, and that becomes part of a whole social regulation of the cycle. So this is just a way of trying to illustrate the notion that there are ritual practices in very different societies that make use of some of the logic of emotions to create a compelling aesthetic experience, and we might think in some ways a transformative experience for people. And certainly many of us have had the experience of seeing some artistic thing and feeling very uplifted and helped by it in some way, maybe healed a little bit in some way by certain things, and part of the process of that might be this kind of optimal aesthetic distance. Well, if you look in any part of the world right now, there's a huge variety of healing systems available, and I've been mentioning some of these as we go along. This is, again, I think a list I showed earlier in the course. We've got Ayurveda, chiropractic, Christian, various forms of Christian healing, divination practices of a great variety, homeopathy, Islamic medicine, naturopathy, a million kinds of New Age medicine, possession cults, again, of enormous varieties, many kinds of psychotherapies, shamanistic practices, traditional Chinese medicine, Unani medicine. So, and this is by no means a complete list, and many of these categories are not one thing. There are actually dozens, if not hundreds, of different things within some of those categories. You can go walk around Montreal to certain neighborhoods, or London, or any other moderate to big size city in the world, and find many of these systems of medicine available, whether off the shelf for practitioners or being practiced at home by people and so on. And many people in the contemporary world make use of more than one of these systems. And many people are making use of these systems who are not from that system. That is, they're really just curious, or they're experimenting or whatever. So it raises an interesting set of questions, again, about what it means to be embedded in a system, which is the typical account of when you go and read ethnographic accounts of healing. It's usually the healer and the patient are from the same culture. They share all kinds of things. The way Jerome Frank talked about this was they had a shared assumptive world. That is, they had a whole set of assumptions about what the world was, the ontology, the way it functioned, and they were participating in that system. That's true to some degree in some forms of medicine for all of us, but it's also true that many of us are participating or borrowing or dabbling in things that are not part of our system. And it becomes a very interesting set of questions. What is our relationship to those? Do we partially buy it? Do we borrow it? Do we have analogies? Do we not really care that much? We're being pragmatic. I think there are a lot of different stances. And again, the efficacy question would be, do those different stances matter? To what degree do you have to be invested in a system, committed to it, profoundly believe in it, have had layers and layers of experience, or to what extent can you simply try something off the shelf and maybe it's going to work for you? So this is the kind of thing we want to say a bit more about. This is a photograph from a street in Bangkok where there's a street lined with vendors who are selling amulets. And these amulets are good for healing and for good luck and for good business and for all kinds of things. And there are thousands of them. They're little clay things. But clearly for some people, they're not all the same. Even though some of them look like they might have been stamped out by a mold, there are tiny differences. And people spend time looking very closely to find the one that's the right one for them, for the purposes that they have and that they need. So there's some interesting process going on there of reflection, of engagement, in which a person is finding the object that's going to help them. A little bit further down the street are shops selling thousands of kinds of pharmaceuticals. And this is true throughout Southeast Asia and South Asia and other parts of the world, that you have enormous diversity of medicines that are available, and in some cases from pharmacies, in many cases really quite readily available from without prescriptions, or with what Stefan X has called floating prescriptions, where you can get a prescription that was written for one person that'll suffice for anybody to take the pharmacy. That happens in some parts of the world. So people have access to a lot of different medicines. To what extent are these functioning like talismans, like the amulets I just showed you? To what extent do they have active plant ingredients that are doing all kinds of things? I think it's an open question in many instances. We don't know a lot about these things, and not many of these have been studied in the same way that a typical biomedical pharmaceutical has been studied. And as I mentioned earlier with respect to Ayurveda, all of this is big business in the sense that there's a lot of money to be made off this because for everyone, their health is among the most important things for them and for their families. And people will spend all their wealth to regain their health if that's what it takes. And that's true of traditional forms of healing. Some traditional forms of healing may be very costly, either because of direct payments to the healer or because the healing ritual requires all kinds of resources, animals that have to be sacrificed or offerings that have to be made to temples and so on. And it may take a lot of a family's resources to support that. So I think you should not assume that just because something is an indigenous form of healing that it's cheap or freely available to people. It really depends. But the important point is that people will, whatever it costs, if they really believe it's going to help them, and if it's them or their child or someone dear to them ill, they will, they'll spare nothing to try to mobilize resources for people. So all of this is feeding off this very basic human need to have solutions for such serious problems. There are other things people can do that don't involve medicines per se, that involve spiritual practices, religious practices, forms of prayer. There is in Buddhism this notion of the medicine Buddha, that there is a kind of Buddha that can heal directly. And I would say in most religious traditions there's a notion of the spiritual teacher or the emblem of spiritual advancement, whether it's Jesus or Muhammad or whatever, as also a vehicle of healing, and maybe the ultimate source of healing from different forms of treatment. And people can do this through a healer, through a priestly caste, like the Asclepian healing I was talking about from ages ago, or they can do it directly to some degree. People can pray directly. Here's a woman doing pujas before a statue in terms of her own health and well-being. Here's a picture from Nepal. I guess I should say, I mean, this is actually Bhushan's father here getting healed. We arrived at this village and he wanted to show us a healer. So he told the people in the village that he had a headache and he would appreciate if somebody could help him. And so they called this old man from the field who came out who had some healing knowledge. And he got some ash, which you can see just by the side of the mat there, and then put some on his forehead, and then said some prayers and did some kind of blowing to try to improve the headache. So this is a particular set of a kind of folk healer in this rural context who is drawing from a mixture of religious and folk knowledge about how to deal with things without all the apparatus of a healing temple or having a status within that. And the healer in this sense is a kind of practical problem solver with a certain set of skills. And there might be other people in the same region who had a different set of skills who would deal with a different type of problem. And it's a practical way to deal with everyday ailments. Here's Sri Lanka. And a healer, again, doing, in this case, a diagnosis, and then offering a medicine dissolved in a glass of water that will provide the healing. What these medicines are, they may be plant medicines, but as in the case of the Chinese shaman that I showed you the other day, they may be spiritual medicine in the sense that what the shaman does is write on these rice paper, which is then dissolved in water, and the person drinks this. And you have this in a lot of Islamic forms of medicine where people will write prayers or surahs or passages from the Quran, and then dissolve that and drink that. This is kind of folk medicine, but connected to the power and the authority of a religious tradition. So that imbues it in people's faith and hope with a lot of power. Here's a Hindu Tamil healer and a Christian healer. These are all, the last three are all from Sri Lanka. So again, to make the point that you have this diversity within most societies at this point, and people will avail themselves both of their own tradition, but depending upon the seriousness of the problem and the resources and so on, they may try other things. If they don't require a kind of religious apostasy, if it's just really, I'm going for a kind of healing practice, people will take advantage of a great many things in the search for something that works. So we have this question to give understanding, how do these things work from our point of view? I mean, each tradition has its own theory of how it works. To the extent that it's a spiritual tradition, the answer in a sense is simple. It's the God or the deity or that heals, and since it's omnipotent and omniscient anyway, it's not hard to explain why this, among other things, can be done by the God. I think I mentioned, again, last time, leaving the Danki's temple, that a woman told me, it's only the God that heals, and the God has cured my colon cancer. So that could be, for a person who is a believer within that system, a more or less complete explanation. You don't have to come up with a mechanism or do any more work to make sense of that if you are working within that system. From our point of view, that's not enough explanation because it sort of puts it entirely outside the frame that we're working in. And so my interest, without wanting to discount that or challenge that in any way, to work within our own system of thinking about psychological, social, physiological processes, to say how much can we say about what else might be going on, because that will give us ways of thinking about integration or understanding our own practices and so on. So here's the Levi-Strauss idea again, with the notion that we have this state of affliction that's being transformed into a kind of mythic realm. And by myth, again, I mean just the overarching stories that we have that are supported by a society as kind of configurations of the way that the world works, that we then have a ritual or a process or a narrative that moves that forward, that somehow transforms the experience, and that goes along with then the transformation of the individual. One way we can understand this is as a metaphorical process. And by that I mean that quite literally and concretely, in the sense that if we think of metaphor as the basic cognitive process, not only cognitive but affective and sensory process, by which meaning is encoded and meaning is transformed, then we can think of our experience, let's say, of feeling really sick and lacking energy and low, of being mapped onto a representation of that, and then as the language and the process creates more and more representation of being alive and vigorous, we feel more and more alive and vigorous as a kind of transformation of experience. So that's at one level of our self-representation, but this analogous metaphorical processes could go on at different levels. So that's what I want to try to argue here, that it could go on at the level of psychophysiological processes, of transformations of bodily sensations, of transformations of our attentional systems and how we're paying attention to things and how we interpret them, of our emotional states, of our interactions with others, and all of which could result in feelings of health and well-being. One way that this has been studied in the laboratory is through the science of placebos. And the placebo as a term is a problematic term because it's been used mainly to dismiss things. Oh, that's just a placebo. We want to see if this really works, so we'll compare it to a placebo. And the idea is that the placebo is just the noise, and then we get to whether it really works. The same research, however, and similar specific paradigms have shown that when you give somebody a treatment that they think is going to have a beneficial effect, it can have a beneficial effect independently of its biological activity. So this is a very interesting idea. And probably there are many different effects going on. So just as the placebo is not really where the focus of attention needs to be, but on the processes that are elicited in the person, that is the stimulus that you're giving the person, the sugar pill or the incantation or the thing that you think has got no specific activity. Biological activity is not really where the action is. It's in what's being evoked in the person. Similarly, what's being evoked in the person is not just one thing, it's many different things. So the placebo effect is not about placebos, and it's not one effect, it's many effects. So what are those effects? Well, they fall into several different classes. Some of them are verbal effects, that if I say or do anything that's going to give you positive expectations, it will have some benefit for you. It will reduce your anxiety. You know, if I just tell you it's going to be okay and you believe me, you're going to feel a little bit better at that moment because you're going to stop worrying. So that's very simple. It may actually create more positive feelings by activating sort of reward systems in the brain, that you feel something very good is coming. And when I talked earlier about the sensual experiences of, smelling something pleasant and tasting something good, or a feeling of a reassuring touch, all of these things may be conveying rewarding kind of stimuli. So that's a whole set of direct verbal suggestions. There's also a whole set of processes that really are about classical conditioning. And this is a very interesting set of phenomena. We now know, for example, that if you take a pill, if you're given a pill and someone says this will make your headache go away, that one of the things that pill does is it activates endogenous pain control systems in your brain. We know this from very interesting experiments done years ago by Howard Levine and Fields, where they took people who were having dental work and they put them in a scenario where they set up an IV, and they then told people they were giving them an analgesic, and about 60% of the people say, yeah, I feel better, the pain went away. So they're showing the placebo effect. Then, unbeknownst to the people, they give them a little dose of naloxone. They can't feel it, it's just a tiny amount. And naloxone is an opiate antagonist. It blocks opiate receptors in the body. And those opiate receptors are there not because to deal with opiates or morphine or opium from outside. They're there because one of the neurotransmitters in pain pathways are endorphins, essentially endogenous opiates. If you give that naloxone that blocks the effect of the endorphins, the person who has said, this is great, I'm feeling much better, go ahead and drill, suddenly says, ouch. And they don't know that they got this. So you can show, through that kind of paradigm, that part of the effect of getting a pill or other intervention that you think is going to be a painkiller is to turn on some endogenous pain control systems. That's not the only effect, but it's one effect that comes with that kind of stimulus. So that's very interesting and very important for a lot of people, because one thing that it does, it breaks down the tendency we have when somebody says placebo or suggestion effect or symbolic effect, to think, okay, it's all in your mind, which means you're talking yourself into this, which means it's not real, which means if you were really honest or if you weren't gullible, et cetera, you would tell us you're in pain. And so poor you, you're really in pain, but you're pretending not to be in pain. It's a whole sort of process of discounting versus the notion that, hey, we actually have internal pain control systems. They can be turned on or off by certain stimuli that could help people to cope. There's an adaptive reason why that's there in the first place. It could help people to cope, and maybe stimuli turn them on. In fact, of course, anything, including an aspirin or including an opiate, will also turn on those systems. So this is an important issue. Again, it's not either or. Every treatment is having these placebo effects as accompanying every active treatment. And in fact, you get a stronger placebo effect with an active treatment because it's constantly reinforcing the placebo effect. Because as far as we know, this is largely a conditioned effect. That is to say, which stimuli will turn that system on. There may be some unconditioned stimuli. There may be some primary cues that people, for evolutionary reasons, have that will activate something. But you can acquire new cues, new things will turn it on based on experience. So if you have a very good painkiller and you take that painkiller, and it works for you, that image of that painkiller is becoming conditioned more and more to that response, and you'll have a more powerful response in the future, because in addition to the pharmacological effect, you're having your own endogenous effect. So that's an analgesic, one particular type of analgesic placebo effect. There are other placebo effects. There are placebo effects that block nausea, or that block anxiety, or that block the motor symptoms of Parkinson's disease. And they all involve specific pathways. And so in each case, understanding how they might work means understanding something about the dynamics of the regulation and the conditioning of that system. And it's a complicated issue, because classical conditioning of this type is a complicated phenomenon, because in a way what's being conditioned is a compensatory response to an expectation or a stimulus. So it's a complicated phenomenon. I mentioned one other thing here, which is extraordinarily interesting, that Robert Ader showed years ago, which is that you can condition the immune system. This is an accidental thing that he found. He was studying conditioned taste aversions. He was looking at animals. It's very easy for a rat to learn to avoid something that makes it sick. It's hard. I think I might have mentioned this before. It's hard for a rat to learn to pair, a light and a sound. It has to have lots of repetitions to figure out, okay, that light means that sound, and then I better do so and so. But it only takes one trial of tasting a novel food and then getting sick a few hours later for the rat to say, I'm not touching that again. And it makes good adaptive sense. It's incidentally why it's hard to poison rats, because if they get a new food, they'll taste a little bit and they'll wait and see whether they get sick. If they get sick, they won't touch it again. So Robert Ader was doing experiments with cyclophosphamide, a chemotherapeutic drug, and he would give it to rats that would make them really sick. And he was giving them saccharin water to drink, which to rats I think tastes bitter. I don't know quite how we figured that out by showing similarities between saccharin and other things. And he was able to show at some point, over the cyclophosphamide, because it's an immune suppressant, that's part of why it's used in chemotherapy, he was able to show that when those animals on a later day who'd had the pairing of the saccharin water and cyclophosphamide, when they just got a taste of the saccharin water, they showed immune suppression. So that kind of blew him away. That was really, because at that point people thought, well, the immune system is completely separate from the nervous system. They do their own things, and you can't have learning in the immune system except in an analogous way that it has its own way of identifying, foreign substances. And it even showed that could have a therapeutic effect in animals. That is, if you give animals an autoimmune disease like a joint inflammation, that you could actually use the conditioned effect of the saccharin water to decrease the kind of inflammation in their joints. Or the opposite, if you had animals that had cancer, you could use suppression to actually aggravate the cancer and accelerate their. So this has become a whole field of psychoneuroimmunology, which is really interesting, and which points again to this idea that there could be very specific effects of particular stimuli based on your own learning history, based on your own life experience, such that certain things are activating your immune system, other things are depressing them. And of course, the immune system is not one thing. There are different branches that respond different ways, so you have a potential for a kind of regulation there. So that's a whole other set of, quote, placebo responses. And then we have a third set, which is perhaps the most important for us, or at least the first and third are the most important in terms of being the most malleable, which is that we learn not from what people tell us, but from what we see people doing. And so there's a process of learning by modeling, And that's taken on right away. And it's taken on not only consciously, like we might be able to articulate what we learned, but it's taken on non-consciously. That as we mirror, we model what people are doing, and it changes our illness experience. And so we would be acquiring a set of responses without being fully aware that that's what we're acquiring. So these kinds of mechanisms are interesting because they help to explain some ways in which symbolic action, stimuli, interpersonal relationships, the context of healing could be having effects not only at our interpretation of what's going on, which I don't think we have a hard time understanding, or at least accepting, but also at various other levels within the body. And so we want to consider the possibility that all forms of healing, whatever they're explicitly targeting, whether they understand themselves to be working purely at a spiritual level or in terms of some kind of non-corporeal energies, or whether they understand themselves purely psychologically or whether they understand themselves physiologically, that all these systems of healing could be working at multiple levels. And we need to consider the physiological levels, individual processes, psychological processes, relationships, environment, and spirituality. So that leads us to this diagram, which is simply to make that point in another way, that we have many potential processes that could be involved in healing, that most systems of healing privilege a certain level. They have a theory of working at that level. They explicitly target that level. If you go for a talking psychotherapy, then presumably what's important is how you talk to yourself and how you think and how you talk to other people, and that's what you're working with. That's the raw material, and you're trying to restructure it. Of course, there are talking therapies where people talk at that level, but conceptually the therapist is thinking about emotional dynamics, let's say, and feels that the talking is a way to teach you how to regulate or how to just accept or understand your own emotional dynamics. There are other therapies where a person might say, what you need is massage. And we're going to give you massage, and now you have a very powerful tactile experience, one of the most basic human experiences. Again, if you think of being a baby and being held, or giving another person a hug, I mean, a very, very basic experience of comfort. We know that if you're hugged by another person, if you feel safe, if you've requested that hug, let's put it that way, and you're hugged by another person, you tend to have cardiac deceleration, your heart rate slows. If you hug yourself, it doesn't do the same thing. Just like it's hard to tickle yourself. I mean, it's really, the brain processes touch by yourself and touch by somebody else quite differently, even though you could argue from a purely sensory point of view there doesn't need to be any difference. So that might be understood, again, at a very basic physical level, that touch has this regulatory process that's there even in very young infants that don't presumably understand very much of what's going on but feel comfort, and it's built into us. If you don't give infants that kind of physical contact and comfort, you know that they develop all kinds of problems, and that's the work of Harry Harlow and others, kind of on love in infant monkeys and so on. But even though something is going on there that doesn't require a lot of thinking about it, once we're able to think about it, of course, it has other layers of meaning. And that's also going on, therefore. So at the same time as you're getting this feeling of comfort, and we know if you get hugged for more than, I forget what it is, 60 or 90 seconds or so, you get oxytocin release and you get all these other interesting things happening, you're also thinking, under ordinary circumstances as a child or an adult, what this means to you. And you're going to carry that thought with you. And in fact, you could elicit some of the same feelings again by remembering and by thinking about that yourself. So these other levels are operating. So I'm not going to go through all of it now, but the point is that we have at each level different processes. I've put the sort of mediating level in the middle, so we can think of different aspects of the brain, different layers or levels of brain processing. The things I'm talking about in terms of touch and sensory things are relatively phylogenetically older, lower level processing in the brain to feel basic comfort. I mean, if somebody comes into the emergency room and is very agitated, under ideal circumstances, we would like to put them in a quiet, dimly lit place, and that would decrease their arousal. The reality is we often don't function that way, and so we don't provide optimal care for people if you were just trying to think about what would you do to just help the person feel a bit calmer now without medications and without restraints and so on. The flip side of somebody's feeling really enervated and has no energy, there are things that you can do to make them feel more energetic and more enlivened that they might experience as very pleasant under those circumstances. Then there's a level of dealing with relationships and the notion of attachment and comfort that comes out of bonding with other people. And there are connections between these systems and other regulatory systems. We know, for example, if you separate a puppy from its mother, it cries, it's upset, it feels pain. We know that that system is partly affected and mediated by endorphins. So the pain, the idea of pain as a metaphor for emotional pain is not just a metaphor. That is to say that the pain of emotion and physical pain have some overlap in their actual pathways. And that has significance both for the phenomenology, why we have a certain language for pain, why that metaphor is intuitively obvious and necessary in some ways, and implications for regulation. In fact, it helps us to understand things like chronic pain in some ways, to understand that there's an intimate connection potentially between these things in some systems, even though you can separate out the emotional and sensory qualities of pain to a significant degree. And just to take that one step further, all the things we're talking about now and talking about this from a sort of psychological point of view, psychosocial point of view, apply equally well to purely somatic treatment. So if you give somebody morphine for pain, for example, some people who take morphine for pain will say, I still feel the pain, it's just not bothering me as much anymore. So it has a stronger effect for some people on the emotional or affective quality of pain than on the sensory quality per se. So it's just, I'm trying to break down the sort of either-or thinking and say we can actually say a lot more specifically about different processes, and some of those processes cut across a wide variety of treatments. So then we have a level of sort of brain processing of mental, psychological phenomena that involve our representations of the world, verbal representations, imagery representations, and the relationship between those. So as mentioned already, we have language as a way of reframing experience. We also have imagery that is representing experience, and we have an interaction between the two. There's situations where someone comes for help, and it's clear that part of what's troubling them is a certain idea that's reverberating over and over again, catastrophic thoughts that they have. Sometimes those catastrophic thoughts are not words, they really are images that people have. They have horrible images they can't get out of their mind that are reverberating over and over again. And those are probably somewhat different processes that can reinforce each other. And we can intervene at those levels. So those are all within the person, and that's typically the domain of psychology in terms of how we theorize this, but you can see that there are many different healing systems that might be conceptualized as working more or less on some of these levels. But there also are things outside and beyond the person. So there are problems and solutions that are constituted at the level of families, family interactions, that are constituted at the level of communities or other kinds of social groups, and that are, in some sense, global or transcendental problems of the meaning of life, of the sort of collection, the direction of a whole society or of humanity as a whole. And people suffer from these things. I mean, arguably, on some level, some of the suffering that people are having in our society right now about equity in our society and the responsiveness of government and so on could be seen as a part of a very large phenomenon that all developed societies are experiencing right now. And so the ill is at a certain level, and maybe the solution needs to be at a certain level. So the point of showing you this diagram, which is not complete, which has a lot of arbitrary things, think of it as a bit of a cartoon, but it does make a couple of points. Healing, helping involves many, many different processes. All have won and all must share the prize. Things that are conceptualized at one level may actually be operating at different levels, and the part that a theory or a healing tradition emphasizes, just think of different forms of psychotherapy, let's say, may not turn out to be the most important level or the one that's actually having the most traction, either generally or for a specific case.